Are you looking for more great content like you get here on the Conversations with Women in Sales podcast? I encourage you to check out the Sales Experts channel for 500 presentations from 150 global sales experts, all in one place. Always free, always fabulous. Don't miss another minute. Subscribe to the Sales Experts channel on Bright Talk at brighttalk.com.
Barb Giamanco helps innovative mid-size and enterprise companies build lead generation programs that improve sales results. To learn more, visit scs-connect.com.
You're listening to Women in Sales, a podcast dedicated to becoming the best resource in the world for female sales professionals. Here's your host, Barb Giamanco.
All right, let's rock and roll. Joining me today is my guest, Brooke Bachesta. She is an SDR Manager at Outreach, a leading sales engagement platform. She tells me she's passionate about diversity and inclusion and specifically bringing more women into sales and sales development organizations. She is a known thought leader that has been published in publications like Forbes, Apple News, and Sales Hacker. Recently, she was recognized as a Girls Club Saleswoman to Watch in 2019. Welcome to the program, Brooke. Glad to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, Barb.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. I loved when you sent me the suggested topic, fighting the bro culture. I can get behind that. And for all of my loyal male listeners, we're just poking a little fun here, but we are going to talk about the importance of diversity inclusion, what that means for business. Brooke, let's kick it off by talking about the hiring process at Outreach. Let's cover that first, and then probably the tie to that would be the type of persona that you're looking for to bring onto sales teams.
So at Outreach, most of our SDRs, we've recently made the transition into looking for folks who are recently graduated or have like commensurate experience, meaning they are new to sales or SaaS, want to get into a selling position and perhaps haven't done it before. And as far as hiring process, we're proud that we've built out a process within the org. So all of the managers, I'm one of 5. We each have our areas of captainship. Mine happens to be recruiting, which is why I'm here chatting about this today. Whenever we're looking for folks, we're fortunate that we have a strong inbound demand from folks, externally who are saying that they'd like to apply to Outreach. Our recruiters, we have several of them. However, they serve the entire company. So, I'm not in a position where I can ask Mandy to go do a bunch of outbound recruiting, as I'm sure many of you all listening are in a similar predicament. So what we do process-wise is we'll have folks apply. The first step is actually after resume review, they take an online assessment, and that's done through a company called OMG.
That's Objective Management Group. My good friend and colleague, Dave Curlin, runs that company.
Yes, thank you. But they are wonderful. And part of the reason we've employed this assessment, it's not an aptitude test. We know that there's so many bright, wonderful humans who apply to this role. It's a sales aptitude test. And what we're looking for is this person going to be successful in an outreach sales position? So we've kind of toggled the questions, help them tailor those questions for them. What we found that it helps us do is oftentimes when we're recruiting, we all do it. I'm guilty of this. We look for folks who are similar to ourselves. And if you are looking to increase your diversity, sometimes it's helpful to have a non-biased assessment come in and say like, hey, you may not have thought of this person initially, but I think that they would actually be really great and it's worth bringing them in on site. So we've been pleased with the results of that. After they take the assessment, they do a phone screen, then an on-site interview, pretty standard loop of 4 people meeting with managers. At that point, we decide whether or not we'd like to offer them.
We used to call it at Microsoft running the gauntlet. So it sounds like you actually involve a number of different people in the interviewing process to support what you start out with the assessment. What Dave would say is it's looking for your sales DNA. Do you have the DNA to be a salesperson? And you know what? It's okay. Not everybody does. All right. So now you walk through this process, the assessment, the phone, the on-site. How long does that process usually take? Tell us a little bit about that.
So we certainly want to be selective in our hiring process. However, we, as a company that's growing really quickly, we hire almost every other month. And so we do try and move quickly when we find a candidate that we're excited about. I think we have moved people through this process in as fast as a week. Try and keep it to around 2 weeks, though. We know that it's a really really competitive hiring market. We want to be respectful of our candidates' time.
Now, you talked about personas briefly. You talked about some of the characteristics, and I think it's really important what you said, Brooke. You want to be careful that you're not hiring people just like you. In fact, smart sales leaders in general, know that the more they know about their own strengths and weaker areas, things they're not naturally strong in, it's important to build out a team that can round out those strengths among the team members. You mentioned bringing in people who are newer, a little less experienced. What else do you look for, though? Are there certain, so I know you run them through the assessment, and there must be certain things that you're looking for. Do they fit the outreach culture? What are some of the other things you're looking for?
Yeah, great question. One thing to be careful of with the word culture, and so we do have core values here at Outreach, and some of those are things like, are they a hungry craftsperson, meaning do they display intellectual curiosity, got your back, like would they be a good team player? We've got a whole list of those. Part of the reason I think we've done that is because it's really easy to get sucked into like the little C culture of like, do I like this person personally and would I like want to hang out with them?
Good point.
Pretty dangerous. So we try and employ that. Do they fit the core values? Another thing that I try and look for is, we call it a figure it out factor. And I think we actually brought it in from the OMG assessment. But essentially, SDRs, it is a very prescriptive job in that, you come in, we have a lot of direction around like what you're allowed to say on the phone, who we'd like you to be reaching out to, personas that would be good for the business to chat with. But there's also a fair amount of change. And so we look for folks who are adaptable, thrive in like high variability environments, and are able to ask questions and seek out help when they need it and raise their hand and say, hey, I'm drowning or I need some help here, but also, be able to solve problems on their own or seek out help on their own. Another thing that we found has been pretty interesting is, and we've shifted this within the past year, we used to be looking for folks, say a year or two of experience under their belt, thinking that like, hey, maybe these people would have a better perspective on what is and isn't going to work and maybe not need so much hand-holding. Those things are true, certainly, but a challenge that we ran into is obviously burnout is a challenge that we're constantly fighting in an SDR org. Sales in general is a grind. SDR specifically too. You just get a lot of no's. And so we want to make sure we're setting people up for success, bringing them in and then moving them into positions, whether they want to be a closer or an account manager or what have you, within a reasonable amount of time. For us, that's about a year to a year and a half. And the reason I bring that up is we used to look for folks who had closing experience, but we find that folks that come in who have closed before do tend to struggle, not with the script or the concepts or anything. It's just they're so eager and so great at talking on the phone to their prospects is sometimes they end up disqualifying, or their prospects will end up disqualifying themselves and be like, well, I just had a fantastic conversation with Jane. Like, why do I need to meet with an account executive? She set me up so well and I'll just keep in touch with her. So that's part of the reason why we're also looking for folks who are net new to sales or looking to make a career change. We're training a brand new muscle rather than trying to backpedal on closing, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And there are a couple of excellent things that you said there that I wanted to ask you to expand on a little bit. One, when you mentioned the figure out factor, I kind of chuckled to myself, Brooke, because that's something that's important to me. And I can tell you that I am happy to give people all kinds of training and support. But as you know, as I know, as anybody else who is in sales for longer than 5 minutes, you can never predict everything. And so the ability to think for yourself and to figure things out is really important. Now, the question I have for you is, management provides the foundation to allow people to do that, because when you're trying to figure things out, you might make some mistakes. Do you clearly communicate to people that you know there's a little bit of a basis, like, okay, don't break any laws, but we do want you to kind of take some risk and figure it out? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a great point. We all like guidelines and guardrails. So when folks start at Outreach, we actually put them on a dedicated new hire team with their own manager. And the idea is we hire in classes. We find that, one, it's great for just camaraderie and retention. Also fantastic for making sure that, we've got the right people and the right personalities all working together to play off of everybody's skill sets. So when they start, they're put on that team and they learn very basic, like they're only allowed to use one sequence, they're calling one type of persona, and we slowly introduce them to new, more complicated aspects of prospecting. Some things that we do to incentivize, like, hey, we realize that you guys are all super smart. You have special skills. We might not even know what they are. So we have what we call tiger teams. And a lot of times we will pull folks in, or anybody who raises their hand as well and says like, hey, I'd like to test something out in this new area. And we're pretty open. And I love, like my director, Steve Ross, he's great at this. He says, if you've got a plan and you want to try something out, come to me with a plan and execute on it, and I will support you 100%, assuming you're doing your regular day job. So we try and come up with areas to help people exercise that muscle of thinking creatively and critically about problem solving, while also running the plays that we've outlined for them.
Perfect. And then the only other thing I was curious about, and given what you just said about how you have these tiger teams and you give people the opportunity to test and they've sort of got a little bit of a safety net, you're also bringing on younger, less experienced people. Do you ever have some concerns about the fact that less experienced people are often the first point of contact and they're expected to have conversations with people that are going to engage them enough to want to move them to the next level? So I'm confident you've all thought about this. What kind of training or onboarding do you do to help these folks make that connection with somebody who's at a higher buying level, if you will, or a higher business level experience?
Yeah, that's a great point. While I love all the SDRs that we work with, you're right. We wouldn't necessarily want a 22-year-old who just graduated making decisions on where our pipeline is as a company. So that being said, we do start them out with smaller accounts. Many of them work, SMB micro accounts where there's only one decision maker, and then they're using a prescribed sequence with prescribed messaging. As they, I'll say graduate for lack of better words, out of new hire camp, they start to gain access to more complicated plays. And with that, one of those plays is like leveraging things like Team Link, executive referrals, sometimes even leveraging our board members or RVPs internally. And with that, there's a lot of oversight from the management team of like, okay, if you're going to ask, let's put a list together and I will ask with you to exercise that muscle and make sure that we're doing this in an appropriate way with the necessary level of decorum to reach out to folks so that, to your point, we don't have a very eager, hardworking SDR spamming a CRO at another company who might shut us down.
Listen, it's all well and good to give everybody a start. We all got to start somewhere, but you just can't hand a newbie a script and think they are going to be able to have the capacity to understand how to connect with a VP of sales or a chief revenue officer as an example. So some great points there, Brooke. All right, let's dig a little deeper into the diversity aspect of it. Outreach is a tech company, common in the tech world. I thought some of this would have changed a little more quickly, since I started back in the day. We still do lack some diversity in teams. And when I think about diversity, I'm thinking about diversity of thinking as well as gender and some of the cultural aspects and things like that. What are some of the things that, so beyond using, say, an assessment, it sounds like you have a pretty well thought out approach for the kind of people you're trying to attract. How do you really monitor and make sure that there's enough diversity on teams? And do you use special events, or what do you do to draw in people who maybe don't fall into the normal quote unquote pools of where you'd find folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Number one, I think it's worth noting, I'm probably one of those people who's not a normal quote unquote salesperson. My degree is in English literature, and I didn't know that sales was even a career path, and I fell into it almost on accident. I'm very fortunate that I did because I really enjoyed it. I think there's a lot of folks out there who either don't know that it's a possibility or aren't interested in whatever their concept of whatever they think sales is. And so one thing that we've been doing is actually, since we're recruiting folks, who are recently graduated, we've been going to college campuses and trying to get away from just the career fair booth. Those are delightful for folks who know what they want to do and they have, their laundry list of companies that they're interested in talking to. As a startup, we found, however, that most people who go to those are either not interested in working for a startup and they all go to the Googles and the Microsofts and the other large, well-known companies, which is fantastic. But we had a hard time getting traffic to our booth. And there was also not that many people who had self-selected and they said that, oh, this is for a sales position. They're like, no, not for me. So what we've started doing is actually getting into the classroom. And so I've worked with our recruiting team. I've also gone with our other manager, Julianne. Side note, I think it's important to have, if you do have female leaders, have them go out and meet with folks. If other young women see women in positions that they could see themselves in, more likely to apply. So we've gone on to campuses and reached out to professors who either run sales departments, which are fantastic, like Dr. Dover or Dr. Anita Dale up at Purdue, Dr. Dover's at UT Dallas, who have sales-specific programs or just general business programs, and say, hey, I am reaching out from a startup. There's a lot of opportunity here. I noticed that there aren't a lot of startups on your partners page. Quite frankly, we're not in a financial position where we can afford to be a sponsor, but we would love to come on site and teach a class. One class that we've done is Cold Calling 101. We did this at Purdue and it was pretty successful. We actually ended up getting a hire out of that. We went on site. worked with the marketing professor, came in and did 45 minutes on, these were all students in marketing. And so one of their projects, I think they were either going to do something related to cold calling or had already done it. So we did, here's some non-proprietary, like how to handle objections, important things to keep in mind. Then at the very end, we just did like, hey, this is what an SDR position is. Also, if you're interested in applying to startups in general, here's some questions that might be worth asking. So we tried to make it as little of an outreach commercial as we could. Obviously, we were wearing outreach t-shirts and we handed out stickers and we did that song and dance, but we wanted it to be, okay, how can we provide value to these students, many of whom don't know what they want to do post-graduation or haven't even considered sales. So that was a really good opportunity to meet with people who hadn't considered sales before or just hadn't decided like what they were interested in and get them interested or raise the awareness of startups, SaaS startups, sales specifically. So we found a lot of success with things like that.
Well, and I think that's great. And I'm so glad you brought it up, Brooke, because it's one of the 3 goals of this particular podcast is to help encourage more women to pursue a career in sales. Listen, you're among the majority who say you fell into it by accident. I tend to be in the minority because I really enjoyed it, even when I was first selling on the retail floor, and I just happen to love it. We want to attract women, and often they don't know what they don't know. And I've interviewed a fair number of guests that have actually even come from finance roles or marketing roles and decided to try it and really ended up loving it. So I think it's great to get out there to let them know about those sorts of things. I also appreciate, and I'm sure they do too, that you give them some pointers on questions to ask to uncover a little more data, which is typically what we would do in sales anyway, isn't it? The irony there. Because, there are different levels of startup. Yes.
Absolutely.
So sometimes people might think startup, 2 people in a garage, and I'm not saying that's bad, but when I think of outreach, I realize you're in technically more of a startup growth mode, but I wouldn't call you a tiny little company either.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's, and especially for a young person who is potentially moving across the country, like that is a very scary proposition to say, I'm going to move oftentimes on my own dime across the country to somewhere where I don't know anybody for a company and in their mind could be gone tomorrow. Like that's terrifying. So,
well, of course, I think it would be terrifying for pretty much anybody. And then we don't have time to get into it here today, but let's face it, people do still have these hidden unconscious biases about sales. And you can imagine that someone considering a move like that has probably got friends and family in their ear going, really? Sales? Are you sure? So there are probably a lot of other things that happen there. So now diversity is important. And as I said, I very much believe, and I feel like sometimes we don't talk about it enough, diversity is all about diversity in thinking and perspective, as well as some of the other things we commonly think about. And let's talk about retention. Now, you already mentioned the SDR, the BDR, sales development, business development rep role has a shorter lifespan, but how do you encourage and help develop retention among the team, knowing that sometimes people might be ready to move into the next role, but perhaps there's not a role open to them? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I think from the get-go, we set expectations early on. So even as folks are applying, we say like, hey, this role, our ask is that this person would be in seat for about a year to 18 months. That's typically how long the role is. Obviously, if folks are killing it, like we had one individual who moved much quicker than that, but we have some tactical requirements related to quota attainment where it's like, once you reach this bandwidth threshold, you are now eligible to apply for a new position. I am so thrilled that our executive team is very much aligned in that they want to treat the SDRs like a farm team for the rest of the company. So we've been able to move people into roles. Account executive is perhaps the most obvious one, and a lot of folks come in and self-select and say, yes, I do want to be a closer. But we also have a lot of people, speaking of diversity of thought, who are wonderful SDRs, but they say, you know what, closing is not my jam. I don't think I want to do it. And we want to retain those people. So we've moved people into positions like account management, client engagement. That's very much like a project manager. Once the deal is closed, they're in charge of onboarding over 6 weeks with a customer and then passing them off to account management, team lead positions. I think we've actually moved somebody from SDR to IT and security, InfoSec. So we really try and have that conversation early of this is how long we would expect you to be in seat from a business perspective. Like this is the kind of output that we would require just to be very point blank about that, but also start having the conversation early meaning like 6 months into their role. What is it that you would like to do so that we can start asking around the organization of where, you might be best suited or find more success?
I think it's a great approach. You also just sort of illustrated a couple things, the importance of making sure that you're communicating with people often and early. Certainly younger workers coming into the workforce are very, very curious to know how the organization they work for is going to support them in their career. They want to understand what growth path is. I also like that you set expectations. I do sort of chuckle sometimes when I meet somebody who's new to selling. They've been in an SDR role for a year and they think they're ready for VP of sales. Maybe not so much just yet. The other thing I think was cool about what you said is that people can get in and figure out there are certain things they feel really good about and they want to make a contribution there, but maybe closing isn't their thing. The fact that you recognize they have other strengths that can support the business in other areas, to me, is a good win, which I really love. Now, I've got one more question for you before we start to wrap up the program, Brooke, and it's this. So we've talked about diversity and inclusion. You do a great job with the onboarding. You've already sort of really worked hard to make sure you're bringing the right people on the first time and getting them in the right seat in the bus. Now, let's talk about some of the organization-wide KPIs. How do you make sure that reps who've got great, awesome selling skills, how do you make sure that they're also following the expectations just like everyone else? So an example might be, I don't want to say it's just from younger workers, but it does happen. No, you know what, Brooke? Thanks, man. But don't worry about that KPI for me making phone calls because I don't need to cold call. I just book all my meetings via email. Like, what? What do you do about that? How do you make sure that everybody understands that you are all responsible for some baseline expectations?
It's a good point. So for starters, everybody has the same KPIs and you get them on day one and that is the law and there's not much room for discussion. However, if you are someone who has found a way to be successful, and I say successful, I mean consistently hitting 150% of your quota, I'm always open to hear about like how, if you'd like to test something out, or perhaps like to focus sequences, a great example. You'd like to focus your efforts on more targeted sequences within your commercial accounts, and there will inherently be less of them. So the standard KPI, you may be doing less, but the output is the same. So that's important. Dials, I have a hard time getting behind making less of them, as I find, you can usually find people to talk to. That being said, it is something that, people are afraid of the phone, and it is a thing. They're trying to make them more comfortable. One thing that we found really successful, specifically with dialing, is we have floor captains, and they're not a formal team lead position. They're folks who are on the floor they've risen to the occasion of saying like, I am a leader on the floor. I'm vocal, I'm supportive, I'm positive. The managers can lean on them. And we do a call blitz every single day. And we have one of these captains assigned to that blitz. And we've chosen the time periods based throughout, outreach data. When is the best time to connect? So for example, if Sydney is in charge of the call blitz on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. She's in charge of getting everybody hyped up about it, for lack of better words, policing the dials, making sure that people are doing them. If we want to do spiffs around that, we can do that. And we get to leverage Sydney's skills as a leader. And also it's coming from the peers. Like, this is a really important thing that we're doing as a team. And we're all like, there's no meetings. You can't bail on the floor. Everybody's on the floor dialing at the same time. Combat the feeling of I'm afraid to be on the phone. I don't want everybody to hear me. If it's noisy, then no big deal. We play music too. And then just the general buy-in of like, we have a peer who's very well respected and liked on the floor who's helping to drive that along with the managers, of course.
What I think is cool about that is you're also providing support, and I think it helps people to feel confident. I mean, certainly I sometimes scratch my head. I'm not sure why people are afraid of the phone. That's where I started. I love it. I still love talking to people, and I also get it. Yeah. It is a lot tougher to reach people these days. There's a lot more pushback on sales reps. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what to say in order to capture somebody's attention. I don't care what you call it, warm, cold, freezing. If somebody's not expecting your call, it's awkward. You're interrupting.
Right.
So these things can be a little bit tough. So the fact that, you're kind of this whole, we're all in it together at the same time kind of thing, I think is pretty cool. So, but also good for you that you're holding people to, look, this is what's expected of everyone. That's part of the job. And you know what? There are going to be aspects of our job sometimes that we maybe don't like as much. So what I would say is, as Brian Tracy would say, eat that frog. If you really don't like it, get it done. Well, these conversations are always too short for me, Brooke. It's one of the reasons why I love hosting the podcast, to get to talk to amazing execs like yourself. And we do need to wrap it up. So tell us how people can connect with you. Is there anything you want them to know about what's going on with outreach? What are the deets? How do they get a hold of you?
Perhaps most relevant is we are hiring. So if you're interested in applying, please do so on our website for the SDR position. If you're trying to get in touch with me specifically, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. My name is Brooke Bachesta. I think I'm the only one, certainly the only one at Outreach, so it shouldn't be too hard to find me on there. And my email is just firstname.lastname@outreach.io.
All right, that's fantastic. And of course, everybody who listens knows I include those things in the supporting blog post. So I'll make sure that there are links back to you, Brooke, so that people can connect with you. I really appreciate your time today. You've shared some great thoughts about not only diversity and inclusion, but how you help people become successful once you bring them on board. And I think that's such an important conversation, because often people will go to, some don't, but many will go to a lot of effort of hiring the right people, and then you just like pitch them out there. And not only is that frustrating for the individual, but I can guarantee you buyers do not want to train your folks. Speaking of you, managers, I'm speaking of you. All right, Brooke, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it. You promise you'll come back if I invite you?
Oh, absolutely. I would love to.
All right, great. Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for listening to another episode of the Conversations with Women in Sales podcast. I've been talking to Brooke Bachesta. She is an SDR manager at Outreach. They are hiring, so check them out. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. And until next time, happy selling.
You've been listening to Women in Sales. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.